This wasn't just a crash. It was a controlled demolition of trust, of lives, and of the comforting illusion that someone, somewhere, was actually watching the system. The 2008 financial crisis wasn't an accident. It was a slow-motion train wreck, decades in the making, built on greed, deliberate blindness, and a mountain of fake money dressed up as innovation. When it finally collapsed, it didn't just hit Wall Street. It wiped out homes, jobs, savings, and futures. And the most dangerous part? The people who caused it didn't pay the price. They walked away richer. If you were an ordinary person in 2008, it probably came out of nowhere. One week, the news was all about rising home prices. The next, banks were collapsing. Pensions were disappearing. The stock market was in free fall. And suddenly, your government was handing out billions. Not to you, not to the workers who lost everything, but to the very institutions that caused the disaster. The 2008 meltdown is usually explained with technical language: subprime lending, credit default swaps, securitization, systemic risk. But strip all that away, and it's an old story with a modern twist. A story about money and power, left unchecked and unaccountable. So let's rewind. In the early 2000s, Wall Street had a problem. The tech bubble had burst. The economy was shaky, and investment banks were desperate for the next big thing. They found it in real estate. Because in the United States, buying a home wasn't just the American dream. It was the American drug. And Wall Street figured out how to sell it at scale. Enter the mortgage-backed security. The idea sounded simple. Take thousands of home loans, bundle them together, and sell them to investors as one product. The pitch was irresistible. Low risk, steady income, backed by real houses. What could go wrong? Plenty. To keep the machine running, banks needed more and more loans. And when they ran out of people who could actually afford them, they lowered the bar. Subprime loans, adjustable rates, no income checks. It didn't matter, they said, because the risk was spread out, diversified, managed. It wasn't. Behind the scenes, a second layer of bets was forming. Credit default swaps, basically insurance contracts that let investors bet on whether those mortgage bonds would fail. Suddenly, people weren't just gambling on housing. They were gambling on collapse itself. And the closer failure came, the more money some stood to make. At the center of it all were the rating agencies. Moody's, S&P, Fitch, supposedly the referees of the system. Instead of blowing the whistle, they handed out top ratings to toxic assets. Why? Because they were paid by the banks selling the products. A perfect conflict of interest. Everyone was making money, so no one wanted to ask uncomfortable questions. By 2005, the housing market was already overheating. Prices were soaring far beyond wages. Construction boomed in places with no real demand. People flipped houses they'd never lived in. It looked like prosperity. It was a bubble. Then the defaults started. As adjustable rates reset and payments jumped, homeowners began falling behind. Foreclosures surged. The value of mortgage-backed securities dropped. And suddenly, all those safe assets weren't safe at all. Lehman Brothers collapsed in September 2008. Bear Stearns had already been swallowed earlier that year. AIG, one of the world's largest insurers, was next. These weren't minor players. They were pillars of the global financial system. And they were falling apart. Panic spread fast. Banks stopped lending to each other. Liquidity vanished. Markets crashed. People lost homes, jobs, and retirement savings. In a single year, Americans lost more than $19 trillion in household wealth. And then came the twist. The bailout wasn't for the people. It was for the system. The U.S. government, under both Republican and Democratic leadership, rushed to inject hundreds of billions into banks through TARP, the Federal Reserve, and emergency programs. Trillions were made available to stabilize the system. But stabilized for who? Most Americans saw little relief. Unemployment soared. Foreclosures kept rising. Meanwhile, Wall Street executives paid themselves bonuses with bailout money. The architects of the crash weren't punished. They were rewarded. This wasn't just a financial failure. It was a moral one, a systemic betrayal, and it exposed a hard truth. The financial system isn't designed to serve the public. It's designed to protect itself. 15 years later, the dust has settled, but the machinery is still running. Bigger, faster, harder to control. After 2008, central banks turned to their most powerful weapon, money creation. Quantitative easing, a polite phrase for printing trillions out of thin air and pushing it into the financial system. It worked if you owned assets. Stocks soared, housing recovered, corporate profits exploded, but wages didn't. Inequality widened. The gap between markets and real life grew even larger. Then came 2020. When the COVID pandemic hit, governments unleashed an even bigger wave of stimulus. More money printed in 2 years than in the entire decade before. Zero interest rates, emergency lending, cash payments. For a moment, it felt like a new era, like the system could be kept alive forever. It couldn't. By 2021, inflation surged. Not just in food and fuel, but everywhere. What had been dismissed as temporary became persistent and politically explosive. Central banks, once hailed as saviors, were suddenly scrambling to reverse their own excesses. Rates jumped, markets fell, debt became expensive again, and the old cracks, the ones exposed in 2008, started to show. Only now, the system is even more fragile. Corporate debt is at record highs. Governments are deeper in the red than ever. Consumers rely on credit to survive. The financial industry is more concentrated, less transparent, and armed with new tools for leverage and illusion. Crypto rose and collapsed. Fintech promised innovation while quietly recycling old traps. Different names, same dynamics. A system built on debt-driven growth. Policymakers afraid to let bad ideas fail. Regulators captured or overwhelmed. And everyday people left holding the bag when the cycle breaks again. So what did 2008 teach us? First, complexity is not safety. The more complex a system becomes, the easier it is to hide risk and the harder it is to control. Wall Street thrives on opacity. The less you understand, the easier you are to sell to. Second, incentives matter. If bankers expect bailouts, they'll take bigger risks. If regulators know their next job is on Wall Street, they'll look away. And if politicians fear market crashes more than public anger, they'll protect the system, not the citizen. Third, financial education isn't optional, it's survival. You don't need to be an insider, but you do need to understand how the game works. That means spotting bubbles, questioning narratives, and always asking who benefits, who carries the risk, and what happens when the music stops. Because it always stops. The 2008 crash wasn't a one-off. It was a warning, and the same structure is still here. More digital, more automated, more fragile. When the next shock hits, and it will, don't expect justice. Expect bailouts. Expect inflation. Expect volatility. Real wealth isn't just money. It's understanding, awareness, resilience, seeing the storm before it arrives, and knowing how to stand when it does. The system won't warn you. The headlines won't save you. But history will if you're willing to listen. History doesn't repeat, but if you don't understand it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.